Well, that was Nick Higham reporting. Let's talk more about Fats Domino now with the jazz historian and Radio 3 presenter Alyn Shipton, who joins me here in the studio. Thanks so much for being with us. You're just telling me, actually, you played, I think, and you know some of his band. So obviously, give us your perspective on Fats Domino. How influential was he in music?
Well, he came along in 1947, and what he really did at that point was to transform the whole idea of what New Orleans music was about. Up till then, people had really thought that it was jazz, traditional jazz. There'd been the great revival that had gone on in the 40s, and that spread all over the world with people like Chris Barber and Akka Bilk. Fats Domino came along and redefined what New Orleans music was, and in the process led to rhythm and blues and ultimately rock and roll. So he really set the path for two things: a local revolution in New Orleans that allowed people like the Meters and Dr. John to have careers, because he laid the bedrock for that. But equally, he did a lot to keep the city's music in the perspective of people who loved music all over the world. So suddenly New Orleans didn't just mean traditional jazz, Louis Armstrong. It meant somebody who was the fat man, in his own words, in the first great song. And songs like Walk into New Orleans did an awful lot to bring the place and its music to an international public. And
New Orleans, of course, was so central, so pivotal in modern music, not just in America, but across the world.
Yes, and as we heard just now from Nick, I mean, in that piece, he didn't really want to leave the city. So even when he was famous, he could have gone anywhere in the United States. And I met other musicians of his generation who'd bought their millionaires' mansions in Florida or settled in Long Island. He didn't do that. He liked the Ninth Ward of New Orleans. He wanted to be with his people. And he was quite a character locally. The guys that I used to meet and work with who'd been in the band all worked in the same kind of area. So Dave Bartholomew, the trumpet player who wrote a lot of his hits with him, and the man I really adored and was a great drummer, Smokey Johnson, who was the bedrock of that beat in the early bands. He and Frank Fields, the bass player, supported Fats's piano playing, that wonderful rolling, relaxed style that was still hot at the same time.
And you talked about how he loved New Orleans, he didn't want to leave. In fact, when Hurricane Katrina struck, as we know, with such devastating effect, at one stage it was thought he was dead, actually, and but he did have to be rescued.
Well, some graffiti artists put R.I.P. Fats on his house. Well, he was apparently only not far away, having been rescued by a Coast Guard helicopter. And he went to Baton Rouge, and remarkably, and I think because it was him, in an area that's still quite devastated. I was in New Orleans last year looking at the Ninth Ward, and bits of it haven't been rebuilt. But his house, his office, where he lived, was beautifully restored. And when we saw that footage of George Bush going in to give him back the medal that he hadn't been able to receive earlier, it was great and very poignant that his own homestead in the middle of it was fully restored.
So when we look back at the sort of Hall of Fame of American music, how does he compare? How will he be remembered, do you think? What is his place in American musical history, you know, compared to Chuck Berry and Elvis and all those other greats?
I think because he slightly predated them, he set the bedrock going. I mean, people like Elvis acknowledged him as an influence. Very importantly, on this side of the Atlantic, the Beatles and the Rolling Stones both acknowledged him. He repaid the debt with a hit version of Lady Madonna, which went into the charts in 1968. So he was somebody who really set the scene for what was going to happen in the 60s. If he hadn't come along in the 40s and prepared America and Europe for this wonderful rhythm blues style from New Orleans, I doubt very much that the British invasion or any of those things that happened in the 60s would have taken quite the course they did.
Fascinating. Alyn Shipton, thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed for your memories there of the great Fats Domino, who's died at the age of 89.